the hidden Aramaic blessing for abundance that Jesus spoke every single day before Jesus broke the bread. He spoke words so ancient, they carried the breath of creation itself. These exact words were never written down in any gospel. The writer simply said, he gave thanks and moved on. For 2,000 years, billions of people have repeated his name at the table without ever knowing what he actually said in that sacred moment. Hidden inside the Aramaic language, the mother tongue Jesus used every single day of his life, is a blessing so precisely constructed that scholars have described it as a spiritual technology, not merely a prayer. What Jesus spoke before eating was not a social custom. It was an act of conscious connection between the human soul and the divine source. And the moment you understand what those words truly mean, you will never approach a meal or your own inner life the same way again. Today, after 2,000 years of silence, that blessing is being restored, and by the end of this video, it will be fully yours. In the ancient world, a meal was never simply food. For the Jewish people of the 1st century, sitting at the table was a sacred act, a moment where the physical and the spiritual were deliberately brought together. And no one in that world understood this more profoundly than Jesus, who was raised inside this living tradition from his very first breath. Jesus grew up in a devout Jewish home in the hills of Galilee. His mother would have taught him the table blessings from childhood, long before he was old enough to read the scrolls himself. These blessings were not optional devotions. They were woven into the rhythm of daily existence, spoken with the same naturalness as breathing, yet carrying the full and intentional weight of divine encounter. The language of that household was Aramaic, not Hebrew, which belonged primarily to the temple and the scholars, not Greek, the language of commerce and empire, but Aramaic, the warm, living tongue of the common people, the language of the streets, the fields, and the fishing boats of Galilee. It was the language in which Jesus thought, argued, wept, taught, and prayed. When Jesus sat down at the table, whether with his closest disciples, with outcasts, with tax collectors, or with strangers who had simply opened their homes to him, he always paused before eating. The Gospels confirm this pattern again and again. He took the bread. He looked upward, gabitunks. Then he broke it and offered it outward. But here is the silence that history left behind. No gospel writer preserved the actual syllables. They described the action. They captured the meaning. But the sound, the breath, the precise Aramaic words that left the lips of Jesus before every meal were never written down. Until now, they have been quietly waiting to be recovered. To understand why those words were lost, you first need to understand how the Gospels were written. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but the Gospels, composed decades after his death, were written in Greek, the dominant literary language of the Roman Mediterranean world. This translation was not careless. It was intentional and necessary. But something precious was inevitably left behind in the crossing when a Greek writer translated the Aramaic blessing of Jesus. He preserved the spiritual meaning but abandoned the linguistic texture. The word for blessed in Greek does not carry the same root, the same resonance, or the same layered depth as its Aramaic counterpart. The bones of the prayer survived the journey into Greek. The living flesh of it, the breath, the rhythm, the embedded meaning, did not. This matters far more than most people realize. Ancient languages like Aramaic were not simply communication tools. They functioned as acoustic and spiritual systems simultaneously. Each root word in Aramaic carries multiple layers of meaning: physical, emotional, relational, and cosmic, all compressed into a single living sound. When you strip a blessing of its original language, you lose dimensions that no translation, however careful, can fully restore. For 2,000 years, Christianity prayed over its meals in Latin, in Greek, in English, in Portuguese, all of them translations of a living original. Scholars like Douglas-Klotz, who spent decades studying the Aramaic origins of the teachings of Jesus, have consistently pointed to this gap. The prayers we inherited, however beautiful, are echoes of echoes. But the original Aramaic tradition was never fully erased. It survived in fragments in the Talmud, in early Christian texts like in the living memory of Jewish communities who never stopped speaking the language. From these fragments, the blessing of Jesus can be genuinely restored. If these ancient teachings are awakening a desire for inner transformation within you, we prepared to guides on the sacred words where this journey begins. The link is pinned in the comments. Jesus did not bless his food occasionally or when circumstances seemed appropriate. He did it every single time he sat at the table, and this consistency was itself a teaching. The blessing before the meal was a daily practice, a ritual of conscious return to the source of all nourishment. It was not superstition, and it was not performance. It was a trained spiritual habit rooted in the understanding that gratitude opens a real channel between the human and the divine. The central word of that blessing is brichatt, an Aramaic phrase meaning blessed are you. But to translate it simply as blessed is to miss its full architecture. The Aramaic root brich comes from a word that means to kneel, to bow, to genuinely open oneself. When Jesus said brichat, he was not flattering God with a title. He was opening himself, bowing inwardly, creating deliberate space within his own being to receive what was about to come. This was followed by an invocation of Abba, the intimate Aramaic word Jesus used consistently and tenderly to address the divine. Abba is not a theological term or a formal title. It is the word a child speaks naturally to a parent in the morning, close, warm, entirely unguarded. By addressing the divine as Abba at the table, Jesus was collapsing all distance between heaven and the simple act of eating. Then came lakma, the Aramaic word for bread, but lakma in Aramaic carries a meaning far beyond physical nourishment. It holds within it the concepts of understanding, learning, sustenance in every form, and the living substance of life itself. When Jesus blessed lakma, he was not merely expressing gratitude for flour and water. He was consecrating the entire act of receiving life in all its visible and invisible forms. The full blessing brichatt, Abba lakma, was not a formula to be recited. It was a spiritual posture expressed aloud. It turned eating into an act of full, conscious participation with the divine intelligence behind all things. What makes the table practice of Jesus so remarkable is not only what he said, but what he understood to be actually happening when he said it. In the worldview of Jesus, the spoken word was never merely symbolic. It was active. It was alive. The Aramaic tradition he had inherited from his people held that sound. Intention and breath working together produce a real effect in the world, not metaphorically, but in a genuinely tangible sense. This is why the blessing carried such weight. When Jesus looked at the bread and spoke brichatt, he was not simply acknowledging that the food existed in front of him. He was consciously participating in an act of creation, recognizing the divine intelligence embedded in the grain, in the water, in the soil, in the unseen labor and perfect timing that brought that bread to that table. It was saying, in the language of the ancient world, I see you, I receive you, I am not separate from you. Modern inquiry in fields like psychoacoustics and the study of intentional sound has begun to explore what ancient masters already understood, that conscious language directed toward matter with genuine intention changes the quality of what is present. Whether or not you accept any scientific framing, those who practice intentional blessing before meals consistently report the same experience. Something shifts. The meal becomes different. The body receives it differently. The mind quiets in a way it rarely does otherwise. This is the inner power that the Aramaic teachings of Jesus point toward again and again throughout the Gospels. Not a power reserved exclusively for prophets or priests, a power available to any human being willing to pause, breathe, and speak with true, unhurried intention. The table of Jesus was never exclusive. Every person who shared a meal with him left carrying more than food in their body. They left with a living memory of what it felt like to eat in the presence of total, unconditional presence. If this teaching is stirring something in your heart, and you wish to explore it further, we prepared guides that explain the first sacred words where this journey begins, their layers of meaning, and the transformation they carry. The link is pinned in the comments. The question this teaching quietly raises is a deeply practical one. How do we bring this back into our actual lives today? We do not live in first-century Galilee. We eat at kitchen counters and restaurant tables and in our cars between one commitment and the next. The conditions that surrounded the table practice of Jesus seem impossibly distant from the texture of modern daily existence. But the Aramaic tradition does not ask you to travel back in time. It asks you to travel inward. The pause that Jesus took before eating that brief, charged moment of deliberate acknowledgement is available to every human being in every circumstance, without exception. You do not need a synagogue. You do not need an ordained priest. You need only what Jesus himself carried to every table: breath, intention, and a word spoken from the living center of your own being. The transformation that comes from this practice does not announce itself dramatically. It arrives quietly. It begins as a small shift in how you relate to the food in front of you. A sudden awareness that this substance on your plate traveled an enormous distance to reach you, through sunlight and soil and rainfall and human hands, and invisible timing beyond any one person's control. That awareness, that moment of genuine recognition, is where Bridge ATT begins. It is where blessing is born. Over time, those who practice intentional blessing before meals consistently report something unexpected. The habit of pausing to give thanks at the table begins to migrate organically into other areas of life. They find themselves pausing before difficult conversations, before significant decisions, before sleep. The table becomes a training ground for a much larger spiritual posture, the same posture that Jesus modeled not only at meals, but in every recorded moment of his life among people. The blessing before the meal was never truly about the meal. It was always about who you become when you practice presence as a daily, embodied discipline. What this teaching has uncovered is both ancient and urgently alive. Jesus did not bless his food as a religious formality or a public gesture of piety. He did it as a living practice, a conscious, daily act of realignment with the source of all nourishment, spoken in the Aramaic language that was his true mother tongue, using words that carried dimensions of meaning no translation has ever fully reached. If you wish to carry this practice into your own life, the path is genuinely simple. Before your next meal, pause. Take one real breath. Not a hurried one, but a full one. Then, in whatever language lives closest to your heart, or in the Aramaic words themselves, allow something like this to move through you. Bridge Abba, blessed are you, Father, source of all that is, Lachma. I receive this sustenance with awareness, with openness, with gratitude. And then let the silence that follows the words be part of the prayer itself. You do not need to be perfect in your pronunciation. You do not need to belong to any institution or tradition. You need only to mean what you say. The practice of Jesus at the table was never about the performance of devotion. It was always about the reality of connection. Connection to the food. Connection to the earth that produced it. Connection to the invisible source that makes all of it quietly, continuously possible. Begin at your next meal. One pause. One full breath. 3 sacred words. This is how a teaching 2,000 years old enters the present moment. Not through scholarship alone, but through practice. Not only through the mind, but through the body. Not through the weight of history, but through your own living, breathing experience at the table. Visit Divine Light Academy, my site dedicated to bridging ancient spirituality and modern living. There you will find my guides and a deep journey into Aramaic, the living language of the masters, designed to help you access states of deep resonance, clarity, and personal revelation. The link is pinned in the comments. Get ready! In the next video, I will reveal more sacred Aramaic words that unlock deeper spiritual understanding. Turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Right now, before you close this video, come to the comments and tell us, what did you feel? What shifted? We read every single response. And if this teaching found you today, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we go deeper into the ancient frequency codes that were always meant to be yours.